Right, so the only upcoming course to announce is our director Daniel Campbell's lecture, The Origin of Civil Power. That will be on February 29th from 6:30 to 8:30. An online course and a video recording will be provided. Tonight, we're going, in our second lecture on Petrarch. Again, we have to pick and choose all of the poems since, covering 366 in 6 weeks isn't realistic. Um, I'm just looking at the number that I've marked, and I think I need to get a little better at picking and choosing. What we're going to focus on tonight, though, is the canzone. That is the longer poetic form. Most of what Petrarch gives us in the scattered rhymes or the scattered poems are sonnets. The canzone before Petrarch was the preeminent form, the favorite form. So we're going to take a look in particular at four poems 70 through 73, where Petrarch gives us his version of poetic history and the kind of love poetry that he's writing. Throughout all of this, though, we still have the Petrarch who wants to go in multiple different directions, but can never completely fix him. Well, no, it's not that he can never fix himself. It's that he continually refixes himself on goals that will be eternal. It's the problem of loving creatures more than the creator, or loving creatures as something that is not a creation. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy. Hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this vale of tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us, and after this our exile show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, Father and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Um, so as we talk about this tradition that Petrarch's writing in, it's a direct descendant of the troubadours who were writing poetry in the south of France in the 12th century. And they are the ones that basically create the concept of romantic love that exists in a continuous tradition. Um, Certainly, every culture on earth has its form of love poetry, but what the troubadours created is a tradition that extends to this very day. Um, in Italy, the this poetic tradition begins with what's called the Sicilian school. Court officials of the Emperor Frederick II in the first half of the 13th century. And it seems almost as though they picked up writing poetry as a way to sort of increase the prestige of his court. If all the courts in southern Provence have court poets, then Frederick II, who saw himself as the greatest ruler on earth, he needed to have poets at his court. So he actually wrote some himself. His other officials wrote poems. At first, they were just translations from the original Occitan language in which these were written into a dialect that was not Sicilian at all, but a sort of artificial literary language. They also created the sonnet. The sonnet did not exist in any form that we have in the Provençal tradition. And whenever we say where something came from and where we have it, all of these statements are kind of provisional just because so much was lost. Um, if you think about the odds of a poem surviving 800 years in an age before easy printing, in an age in which the very paper that a poem's written on has a real value, the odds that anything survives are fairly low. So, based on what we have surviving, it looks as though the Sicilians invented the sonnet. And quite possibly the first one is this from Giacomo da Lentini, who he was the notary for Frederick's court. And what we see here is from the beginning the way that the Sicilians categorized things much more with much greater organization than the Provençal poets had. This has to be the first time, possibly the last time in history, where Italians took over a concept and added organization to it. So you have the division of the sonnet into the octet, which are an octave of 8 lines, and then a sextet of 6. Those are divided up into 4 lines, 4 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. And the way that the Sicilians set it up, the first 8 lines presented some kind of a problem, and the last 6 lines would in some way respond to that. So in this one, I have a place in my heart for God reserved, so that I may go to heaven, to the holy place where I have heard people are always happy and joyous and merry. I wouldn't want to go there without my lady, the one with fair hair and pale complexion, because without her I could never be happy, being separated from my lady. So the first 4 lines there we have, um, I have a place in my heart for God reserved, or it could also use perhaps better be translated as I have fixed in my heart to serve God, so that I can go to heaven. And then the next 4 verses advance this, but he wouldn't want to go without his lady. If he can't go to heaven without his beloved, could he be happy? And of course, that creates a problem that he then responds in the final 6 verses. But I do not say that with blasphemous intent, as if I wanted to sin with her. Well, there's no way you can say I wouldn't want to go to heaven without this woman without it being blasphemous. The suggestion that heaven could somehow be less if a particular person weren't there with you misses the point of what heaven is. Um, but he kind of sidesteps that here by saying that he doesn't intend to bring his lady to heaven so that he could sin with her. If I did not see her shapely figure and her beautiful face and tender look, since it would greatly comfort me to see my woman shine in glory. So this poem it's lighthearted. It's not intended to be a theological statement, but it's sort of playing with the way that these kinds of poems presented love, and especially the way that they presented the beloved. When you have love poems, you almost immediately run into the risk that the love poet is elevating the woman that he loves far, far beyond what is good. Um, I'm sorry. Thank you for asking if there's a script. Um, yes, there is. I was sharing the wrong document. Okay, so I'll give you a chance to look at the poem now that it's on the screen. Thank you for mentioning that. So a clear division. Everything is neatly organized. 4 lines about one thing, 4 lines about another, and then the final 6 clarify the situation that he doesn't actually want to have carnal relations with his woman in heaven. He just wants to be able to see her saved too. This is the basic form that the sonnet would have. When these poets would write to each other, as they frequently would, they would exchange sonnets. One of them would present a problem and the other one would have to respond, and would have to respond using the exact same rhymes. Um, these are the games that the poets played. The canzone was always the preeminent form. This was modeled on the Provençal canso, but again with much greater structure. The Provençal canso had a variable number of lines, varying rhyme schemes. There was no set way of structuring it. With the Italian canzone, pretty much from the beginning, there is. It has a front and a serma. The front is usually divided into 2 feet, and the 2 feet have the same length in terms of syllables, and they have the same rhyme scheme. Then you have a verse that's called the key verse that picks up the last rhyme. So whatever the last rhyme in the last foot of the serma is, that rhyme is repeated and it begins the serma. And then the serma is quite often further divided into 2 volte, 2 turns, which repeat the same rhyme scheme. Sometimes it's left undivided. The number of verses in both the front and the serma are open. They're not fixed. Usually there's 4 or 5 stanzas, but that length isn't fixed either. So as a result, the canzone has much greater variability, but it also has much greater length. You can go anywhere between about 60 and 180 verses in some of the long, sometimes insufferable canzone. So this is where the poets set forth like theories on love. And from its beginning, Italian love poetry is hyper intellectualized. This is not the work of professional musicians, professional entertainers. The Provençal troubadours composed songs, but they also performed these songs in courts. Some of the troubadours were big authority figures on their own. Some of them were knights, some of them were members of the aristocracy, but some of them were just common performers. The Italian poets from the beginning are always a very small group of an intellectual elite. The court of Frederick II, to serve the emperor who has lands in Germany and southern Italy, requires knowledge of at least 4 languages. It requires literacy. And Frederick prided himself on the intellectual content of his court. So if you're going to be a member of that court, you better have some familiarity with law, some familiarity with Aristotle, and some familiarity with Arabic sciences. When this tradition moves north into Tuscany and north central Italy, again, it's picked up by highly educated professionals who are often judges, public figures of some sense, with extensive education. So when these people write love poems, quite often they want to write what are sometimes called doctrinal poems, where they explain what love is as a psychological phenomenon, which sometimes includes extensive medieval psychological theories about sensation, memory, the will, and the passions. The Rime Petrose, these are 4 canzoni that Dante wrote in December of 1296. So in terms of Dante's biography, these are poems that he wrote years after the death of Beatrice in 1290, after he's published The New Life, the Vita Nuova, which was his early masterpiece, which if Dante had written nothing else, he would have been the greatest Italian poet of the 13th century just for what he wrote in the Vita Nuova, which were the poems that he wrote about Beatrice while she was alive, and then some poems that he wrote after she died. And it's where he presented this theologized love, where Beatrice, he loved her, but from a distance. He loved her beauty, but also her virtue. He became virtuous by loving Beatrice in this sort of, well, no, this definitely literally intangible love that he never touches her. He never seems to have actually spoken to her. After that experiment comes and goes in December of 1296, and we can date this from an astrological reference that Dante puts in. He writes these 4 canzoni that are just so wildly different from everything else that he's written that a lot of Dante scholars wanted to doubt that he even wrote them. This is not Dante who loves a woman who's like an angel and becomes virtuous. This is Dante who loves a woman who has a heart of stone. The rime petrose means the stony rhymes or the stony poems. So he describes the woman as a stone who is insensitive, who doesn't respond to him in any way whatsoever. And what this leads to is psychological horror on his end. It's love as madness, as a compulsive disorder, as obsession. And it produces suffering. And at the end of the final poem, it produces this imagined revenge sequence that he takes on the stony woman. These poems, Dante doesn't refer to them explicitly in the Divine Comedy, but in terms of writing poetry, these were revolutionary poems. What Dante does in them with words had not been done, nothing close to what Dante does in the Petrose had ever been done in the Italian language before. When Dante's writing Inferno, Inferno pulls very heavily from, so it develops the ideas that Dante had first put forth in the Stony Rhymes. And again, these are all canzone. I've put the Italian text on the right, and you can see here we have the ABC of the 2 feet of the front. Then we repeat that C rhyme here in the key verse. And then we have, this is a serma that's not divided into 2. So D, E, 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 that should be a D there, sorry. And then this ends in English, we call it a rhyming couplet. In Italian, they have the much better term of the rima baciata, the kissed rhyme, where you have, you end on the same rhyme. But just the words of this, I've come to that point on the wheel when the horizon gives birth at sunset to the twinned heaven, and the star of love is kept from us by the sun's ray, so that so envelops her transversely that she is veiled. And that planet which strengthens the frost shows itself to us utterly, all along the great arc where each of the 7 casts little shadow. And nonetheless, my mind casts off not one of the thoughts of love that burden me, mind harder than stone, to hold fast an image of stone. So we have this insanely complicated astrological periphrasis that lets us know that when the sun sets, we have Gemini rising. And Venus is hidden from us because Venus is so close to the sun that the sun's rays are covering it up. So the planet that encourages love is impotent at this point. And the planet that encourages, that conforta il gelo, that strengthens the frost, is Saturn. Saturn was the great maleficent of the planets. It had the most negative effect. And that's the planet that dominates the sky all night long. So we have this weird foray into astrology that tells us that for Dante, who was a Gemini, this is a particularly dangerous time for him. That the forces of astrology that wreak havoc are in power here. And so we can date this specifically to December of 1296 based on the position of the stars here and of the planets. And so while we're in December, when it's freezing outside, when it's hardly the lovely season, nevertheless, Dante's mind does not cast off a single thought of love that burns him. His mind that has become harder than stone in holding fast this image of stone, and that is the woman that he loves. And then we have this great second stanza that goes from astrology to meteorology. Rising up from the sands of Ethiopia, we have a wind that picks up, because it's picked up, the sand darkens the air. And the sun's sphere that heats it now is blanketed. And once this wind comes across the sea, it brings us such clouds that we end up having, that we have storms falling. And love, though he takes down his spider webs from the sky on account of the rising wind, he does not abandon me. So a beautiful lady is this cruel one given to me as lady. So beautiful a lady is this cruel one given to me as lady. And the wordplay here in Italian, donna, means both lady as in a woman of high standing. Um, but also lady is the equivalent of lord. Domina, the female equivalent of dominus, literally master. Um, so this cruel woman that has been given power over Dante as his lord. Then in the next stanza, all of the birds have flown south, all of the birds that migrate, except for the ones that are able to handle the entire winter. But they've stopped singing. They've given a truce to their songs and will not sound again until the green season. And all animals that are happy by nature are released from loving, for the coldest extinguishes their spirit. And in the last three lines, again, as we've seen in the first ones, after Dante has this description of the natural world, he comes to himself. Yet mine bears more love, for the sweet thoughts are not taken from me, nor given to me by time's turning, but a lady gives them who has lived but a short time. So Dante is stuck in this place of stasis, that he's not progressing along with the seasons, the way everything else in the natural world is, because this woman that he loves has him frozen in time. The leaves have passed their limit. So now we've gone from the birds that have all flown south to the leaves that have fallen to the ground. And the grass is dead, and every branch on the trees is hidden from us except for those evergreens. And the season's strong and bitter that it's killed the flowers on the slopes that can't endure the frost. And his cruel thorn love for all that does not draw from my heart. And so this image of love here is, again, and this is the image that Petrarch picks up. The figure of love personified is not the chubby naked baby with wings that is Cupid, as often portrayed in like late Renaissance art. This is love as a cruel deity. Love that's posted a thorn in Dante's heart. That's what love is, not a gentle arrow, but a thorn piercing his heart that he does not remove. For I am certain to bear it ever while I am alive, though I should live forever. And these are lines that Petrarch definitely reads and responds to, and we'll see them in once we actually get to Petrarch's poems. And then we have the final stanza here that's seeing the earth opening up and pours forth smoking waters. So here we have steam rising up from underground fonts. And then it freezes and turns the ground into surface like enamel. And this word smalto, enamel, that's one that Petrarch's going to pick up in the first poem of his that we look at tonight. And all of the world around has changed to glass. And I in my war have not turned back one step for all that, nor do I wish to. For if the suffering is sweet, then death must surpass every other sweetness. Che se il martirio è dolce, la morte deve passar ogni altro dolce. And here we've gone from love as obsession to love as a death fixation. That if this suffering can provide some sweetness, and it's that suffering that the obsessive lover holds on to and enjoys in a perverse sense, that here turns into a death desire. And then the commiato here, the congedo, where he sends off his song and addresses it directly. Song, now what will become of me in that other sweet fresh season, when love rains down on earth from all the heavens? If through these freezings, love is only in me and not elsewhere. So what happens when love returns to the world, when spring comes for the rest of the world and they fall into love? Well, what's going to happen to Dante, who is still loving through this storm? It will be with me as a man of marble, if in a tender girl there is a heart of marble. So Dante becomes petrified. And here you have to think of mythology. That Dante, a man of marble, um, it's Medusa, that the woman that he loves and his love for this woman who has a heart of marble and ignores him, um, effectively transforms him into stone, as Medusa does. The second poem, and I won't go through all of these as much as I would love to, Al gran cerchio e poco ombra. This is where Dante writes a sestina, which had never been written in Italian before. So the words that he's rhyming are shadows, hill, grass, green, stone, and donna, which is both lady and master. And this has the same kind of thematic that there isn't a progression in anything. But you have these words, the hills and the grass, that can imply a normal sort of poetic setting, a locus amanus, that is the lovely place where these poems normally happen. But in this case, the stasis remains. But well may the rivers climb the hills before this moist green wood will ever take fire, as ladies do, for me. Though I would endure to sleep on stone all my season and go eating grass, so I might only see where her skirts make a shade. And so this weird combination of biblical references. The rivers may climb the hills. Um, it's that reference from I believe the book of Judges, where the river is reversed in its course. That will happen before this lady will fall in love with him, uh, before this moist green wood will ever take fire. Um, as ladies, come suol fare belladonna, as ladies should do for me. So Dante here at his most humble, ladies are supposed to fall in love with me, but this one never will. Um, but I would endure to sleep on stone, che mi torrei dormire in petra, tutto il mio tempo e gir pascendo l'erba, sol per veder do suoi pani fanno ombra. I would spend my time pascendo l'erba, eating grass, as King Nebuchadnezzar does in the book of Daniel. One of the dreams that Nebuchadnezzar has is that he's going to be punished by God and he's going to go temporarily insane and he'll go eating grass as the cattle will. But Dante will endure this kind of divine punishment. If I might only see where her skirts make a shade. And that line itself, on the one hand, it's if I can only see, if he can be down at her feet and just see the hemline of her dress, he would be content with just that. But then, of course, there's the erotic overtones of wanting to see where her skirt makes the shade. Whenever the hills make black a shade, under a lovely green, the youthful lady makes them disappear, like a stone under the grass. In Italian, that line makes no sense either. It can be read in multiple ways, and 800 years later or 700 years later, they still don't agree on exactly what it means. Sotto un bel verde, under a beautiful green, nothing, just under a beautiful green, the young lady, la fa sperar. She makes it disappear, but we don't know what it is. Is it the dark shadow, possibly? Come uom petra sot erba, as a man stone under grass. So he leaves us with this confusing, ambiguous line that seems to involve the idea of a heliotrope, a stone that can make things disappear, but we're not entirely sure. The next poem in this, Dante takes the idea of the sestina, and he calls it a double sestina, but that's not really what he does. It's a canzone, but it's a canzone with rhyme words. And in each stanza, he takes one of those rhyme words and it dominates. So in the first one, it's donna that dominates. Fairly enough. I mean, the word dominate comes from domina. So donna appears 6 times in the first 10 lines. And then we end with another rima baciata, a kissed rhyme. Um, and then that's the one that takes over the next stanza. So the words that he's using: lady, time, light, cold, and stone. So you have this beautiful cascading imagery of time that does not seem to advance at all, light that doesn't seem to be able to overcome the cold, the freddo, or change the petra into something living. And of course, when that line petra appears again and again, um, that that line, the heart of stone. Yeah, in Dante's time, it's still a line that's used, but the remembrance of where that comes from Ezekiel, um, that when the Israelites have been punished enough in Babylon, then God will call them back to the Holy Land, and he will remove from them their hearts of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Um, but here it's the lady who has that heart of stone from not loving Dante, and he despairs of her heart of stone ever turning into a love of flesh for him. So the end of this song, I carry in my mind a lady such that, although to me she is of stone, still she gives me courage where all other men seem cold, so that I dare to make in this cold the newness that lights up your form, that was never conceived before in any time. Canzone io porto nella mente donna, tal che con tutto ch'ella mi si petra, mi dà baldanza, ond ogni uomo mi par freddo. Sì ch'io ardisco a far per questo freddo la novità che per tua forma luce, che non fu mai pensata in alcun tempo. And this is something that Dante picks up entirely, that this lady is frozen to him and does nothing for him. But the love that she gives him baldanza, not just courage, but baldanza is like even one step forward, almost foolhardiness, such that the ardor that he has makes everybody else seem weak to him, and he dares to, what does he dare to do? He dares to make up this new poetic form. The last of the lyrics, though, which is the most sort of transgressive and the most interesting by far. And this line, the opening line of this, Dante takes for Inferno, the opening to Inferno 31, where we're entering the pit of hell. Così nel mio parlar voglio essere aspro, come negli atti questa bella Petra, la quale ognore in Petra maggior durezza e più natura cruda, e veste sua persona d'un di aspro, tal che per lui, o perché ella s'arretra, non esce di faretra saita che giammai la colga ignuda. Era lancide, e non val com si chiuda, né si dilunghi da colpi mortali, e come avesse ali giungono altrui, e spezzan ciascun arme, sì che io non so da lei, ne posso attarme. And the very lines that Dante is using, the words that he's using here are harsh. These aren't the smooth sounds that he wrote earlier when he was writing his poems about Beatrice. These are words that sound, in Italian, harsh. The line that he uses here, he'll reuse in Inferno 31. Se io avesse le rime aspre chioccio, come si converrebbe al tristo buco sopra il quale ponten tutte l'altre rocce. If I had the words that were as harsh as is fitting to describe the pit of the universe above which all the other rocks point themselves, Dante says at the beginning of Inferno 31, then I would be able to describe my concept better. But because I don't have words that are adequate to describe hell. So when Dante wants to describe the lowest circle of hell, this is the poem that he comes back to. And this poem it's amazing. It's fantastic. The sound in Italian is just breathtaking, but it's also cruel. The idea of love hunting with arrows. There's nothing that's all a cutesy Cupid about this. This is a vicious hunter that's out. And now it's this woman who's out and cannot be hunted by love the way Dante is. No arrow from any quiver finds her naked ever, and she kills, and it avails no man to shield himself or gain distance from her mortal blows, which, as if they had wings, reach you and shatter any armor. And I neither know how nor have the power to protect myself from her. So the woman and love are kind of merged together here in this single figure that is a murderer that's hunting Dante down, and there's nothing he can do. There is no shield that he can hide behind. And he picks up that again in the next verse. I find no shield that she may not shatter, nor place that may hide me from her sight. But as a flower, the tip of a plant, so my mind she holds the summit. And still, as he's trying to dodge from her, she still has fascinated him. I'm fascinated literally in the sense, the original sense of the word, that was almost a magical incantation. Of my sufferings, she seems just as afraid as a ship is of a sea without waves. And the weight that is sinking me is such that no rhyme can equal it. And the image of ships here. The ship that's tossed about at sea is frequently used to describe the lover. And in this case, she is a ship that's in a completely calm sea. Rasping pitiless file, silently wearing away my life. Angoscia dispietata lima che sordamente la mia vita scemi, perché non ti ritemi di rodermi il cuore a scorza, com'io di dire altrui, chi ti dà forza. Why are you not as afraid to gnaw so at my heart, layer by layer, but in the Italian, scorza, scorza, as I am to tell you who gives you your power? And we continue this image of love gnawing away at Dante, con li denti d'amor già mi manduca, like a dog getting the last bit of a bone. And now love throws him to the ground and stands over him. And this is the god of love that's, this pitiless warrior god, with the sword with which he killed Dido. Dido is from the Aeneid. The Roman hero Aeneas falls in love with Dido when he's supposed to go on and found Rome. So the gods whisk Aeneas away, and Dido, seeing her lover leave her, commits suicide. So love has that sword with which Dido killed herself, with which love killed Dido. And he, love, to whom I cry, calling out for mercy, and humbly I beg him, and he seems set to deny all mercy. Now and again he raises his hand and defies my weak life, this cruel one, and holds me on the earth stretched out and supine, too tired to wriggle anymore. Then in my mind arise shrieks, and my blood that is dispersed throughout my veins, fleeing, rushes towards my heart, which calls it, and I turn white. So Dante is literally in shock here, and the blood is being recalled to his core, leaving the rest of his body blanched. He strikes me under the left arm so fiercely that the pain rebounds into my heart. Then I say, if he lifts his arm another time, death will have shut me up before the blow can descend. So about when we normally think of Dante, this is about the least Dantesque image we can imagine, that love is standing over him, slaying him with a sword. And here we enter into this revenge fantasy. Would I might see him split her cruel heart right down the middle, for she is quartering mine. Then death would not be black for me, where I run because of her beauty. For she shoots into the sun and into the shade indiscriminately, this homicidal, thieving gangster. Questa scarana micidiale latera. Lines that Dante will never use anywhere else to describe the woman that he loves. But here, and this is the appropriate image. Dante's now describing love as simply a psychological disorder, a torment. And that's what the figure has become, this homicidal, thieving gangster. Ah, May, why does she not howl for me as I for her in the hot pit? Oh, me, perché non latera per me, come io per lei, nel caldo burro? For I'd shout, I'll help you. And I would too, gladly. And so into her blonde hair, which love curls and gilds to destroy me, I would put my hand, and then I would please her. If I had her blonde braids grasped in my hand, that to me are become a scourge and a whip, taking hold before terse, I would pass vespers and the compline bell with them. And I would not be pitying or courteous. I would be like a bear when it plays. And if love whips me with them, I would take vengeance more than 1,000 times. And into her eyes, whence the sparks come forth that inflame and kill my heart, I would look from up close fixedly to avenge the fleeing that they have done. And then I would give her lovingly the kiss of peace. So it's turned into a violent revenge fantasy. Song goes straight to the lady who has wounded my heart, but steals away from me what I am most greedy for. Strike her through the heart with an arrow, for to take vengeance is a lovely honor. Che bella notte s'acquista in far vendetta. And that last line, that to take vengeance is a lovely honor, is something that everyone in medieval culture would agree under the right settings. That if someone kills someone in your family, you're duty bound to strike them back. Dante's applying the cruel law of vendetta here to the woman that he loves who ignores him. So looking over these four poems, number one, these are the poems that Petrarch saw in Dante, something that he would develop. Petrarch doesn't go as far as Dante does in the language of violence. But the idea of being stuck in time, the idea of turning into stone, being stuck in stasis because the woman completely ignores you. That's in many ways the central idea of the poems that Petrarch writes. And it also shows us a very different Dante than what we're used to. That the Dante who writes the theologized love, the woman who is going to lead Dante to God, that was not the only alternative for Dante. There was a very different way of approaching love as purely a passionate fixation, a passionate fixation that turns into suffering and rage and dreams of violence when denied. That other version of one is a love that Dante abandoned completely. And in the Divine Comedy, it seems clear that this is part of the life that he's blaming himself for, when in the Divine Comedy he presents himself as a sinner who's basically lost, which is what he is in Inferno 1 and 2. And these poems were written, just 3 years before the fictional date of the Divine Comedy. This other Dante that is not the Dante as Dante presents us, Petrarch sees this and it sort of reopens love poetry into something that isn't what Dante left it as. Dante left love poetry as Beatrice who leads us to contemplate beauty and virtue and therefore to God. That's not the real love experience. That's the love experience you can have of an ideal who is no longer living. And so you idealize her into something that can lead you to God. What Petrarch does is sort of bring love back down to an earthly level, a conflicted level where you have to see, is this taking me away from God? And before we actually continue into Petrarch's poems, we'll pause here for just a second. If you'll excuse me, I will be right back in just a minute. If there's any questions, please go ahead and type those in chat and I'll deal with them once I get back. I managed to leave my water in another room, and I definitely talk too much to lecture for 2 hours without significant amounts of water. Okay, so now, with that good 40-minute introduction, we'll go on to the second block of poems, 67 through 127. Originally I'd written through 132, but it makes more sense to cut it off at 127 and to start with some of the very beautiful poems in the 130s next lesson. In these poems, Petrarch has put a significant number of canzoni. Still, sonnets are always by far the most. But the terms you have to use to describe Petrarch, the progress of his stasis kind of develops here. And what I mean by that is the basic problem that he has of wanting to devote himself to God and a love of God, but constantly being torn away by love of Laura and love of poetic fame. And whatever he wants in the moment, he wants completely, completely enough that you can forget that just in the previous poem, he denounced this entirely. That is something else that's so modern about Petrarch, at least the way Petrarch presents himself in these scattered rhymes. And we have to keep in mind always that the scattered rhymes are not a simple biography. Petrarch has very carefully crafted a story that's ambiguous, but it's definitely crafted. This is somebody who knows how to create a persona better than possibly anyone in all of Western history. All literature in the Middle Ages is didactic literature. Everything that's written in the Middle Ages is intended to educate on some level. Petrarch absolutely has a didactic goal in mind with this. And so as an author, the way that he presents himself as writing the poems is often not going to be reality. It's going to be this ideal that he's putting forth for a purpose of instruction, which is not to say that the entire thing is just made up and that this is just a literary exercise. He talks about Laura everywhere else in his works. In the Segretum, which is his dialogue with St. Augustine, and St. Augustine is his absolute Christian hero, he describes the exact same problem. So this is a part of Petrarch's actual life. But of course, the way that he's presenting it in these poems, it's stylized a bit for his purpose. So 68. L'aspetto sacro della terra vostra mi fa del mar passato trager guai, gridando, sta su, misero, che fai? E la via di salire al ciel mi mostra. Ma con questo pensiero un altro giostra, e dice a me, perché fuggendo vai? Se ti rimembra, il tempo passa ormai di tornar a veder la donna nostra. I che il suo ragionar intendo, allora mi agghiaccio dentro, in guisa d'uom che ascolta novelle, che di subito la corre. Poi torna il primo, e questo dà la volta. Qual vincerà non so, ma fino ad ora combattuto hanno, e non pur una volta. The sacred aspect of your native place makes me sorrow for the evil that is past, crying, arise, you wretch, what is it that you do? And shows me the way to climb to heaven. But with this thought, another one contends, saying, why do you run away? If you recall the time now is passing in which you might turn to see Our Lady. I understand what it says, and I turn to ice inside, like a man who hears news which suddenly overwhelms him. The first thought returns. The other flies. Which will win, who knows? But they've fought till now, and more than a single time. So this is written probably in 1341 when Petrarch's making his trip to Rome to be crowned as poet laureate. But here we have, what do I want to do? Do I want that way to climb to heaven, or do I want to turn and see my lady? And just the thought of this freezes him, turns him to ice inside. And the references, the imagery from the Petrose is clearly that the man turning to ice, the woman who's icy as well. And these thoughts are warring with each other. And which one's going to win? Who knows? But they fought before, and more than just a single time. Um, so not only do we have poems in which Petrarch's wanting two different things, but now we have poems about how he wants two different things, and how he's going to continue to want those two different things. The four poems that I want to spend the most time on are 70 through 73, and these are a series of canzoni, and putting four canzoni together itself is calling attention. That this is sort of an important thematic unit. So this first one, Lasso me che io non so in qual parte pieghi. This is a poem where Petrarch is ending each of the strophes with a citation of a previous poet. So we have here five different strophes, and one by one, he ends up citing a troubadour poet, Arnaut Daniel, then Guido Cavalcanti, who was Dante's friend, older than Dante, and then Dante. And of all the poems that Dante wrote, the one that Petrarch cites is Così nel mio parlar, the fourth one of those Rime Petrose. Then he cites a poem from Cino del Pistoia, who was a very good poet. Unfortunately, Cino had the historical luck of being friends of Dante and Petrarch and writing poems to both of them. So trying to be a poet while corresponding with the two greatest poets in Italian history. And then in the fifth, Petrarch goes ahead and cites himself. Nel dolce tempo della prima etade, in the sweet season of my early youth. That is the title of poem 23, which was his first canzone in the work. So, May, I don't know where to seek for hope that has been false so many times before. If there's no one who will listen with pity, why should I send the same prayers to heaven? But if it should chance that I'm not prevented from ending these sad songs before my ending, let it not weigh heavy with my Lord if I ask to sing freely among the grass and flowers. Drets et razones que chant in demori. It is right and just I should sing and be happy. So we begin with him wondering, why should I seek hope? The prayers that he has, and the prayers are ending these sad songs. That is of being able to move on from Laura, to move on from love poetry into just contemplation of God, into the religious life that he seeks. And Petrarch, again, he was a cleric and he was a very devout Christian. One of the works that he writes is on the solitary religious life. That is not actually monasticism, not taking vows as a monk, but he wrote a work on the kind of solitary life that the lay Christian could lead. Sort of Petrarch's humanism here, Christian humanism, where you see him wanting to bring this aspect of monastic life to everyone. So these prayers that he has, which almost certainly in real life were real prayers, I think all of us who in our youth had fallen, if not in lust, if not in love, at least in compulsive desire of someone who ignored us, know what it is to pray to God that you can stop fixating on somebody who ignores you. And so that's what Petrarch brings up in the first stanza. Let it not weigh heavily with my Lord if I ask to sing freely among the grass and flowers. It's right and just I should sing and be happy. That he wants to be liberated from this love that is a love that he does not want, that he wants to be freed of this. For it is right that I should sing sometimes, since I have sighed so very long, that it's never soon enough to begin to counter so much grief with smiles. And if I could only grant those sacred eyes some delight, and I'm realizing since I'm posting this in facing page translation, I might as well just read the original since you can read along in English. Ragione ben calcuna volte io canti, però c'ho sospirato sì gran tempo, che mai non incomincio assai per tempo per adeguar col riso il dolor tanti. E se io potessi far con gli occhi santi porgessi alcun diletto, qualche dolce mio detto, o me beato sopra gli altri amanti. Ma più quando io dirò senza mentire, donna mi prega, perché io voglio dire. And in verse 15 there, we have that reference to those sacred eyes. The three poems after this are referred to as the Canzone degli Occhi, the songs about the eyes, where he discusses, he fixates on Laura's eyes throughout three entire canzoni. And then moving on to Dante. And in this one, in the previous one, there's nothing really in his lines that's particularly Cavalcantian, that's particularly in the way that the poet that he cites wrote. And in this one, in the first stanza, there's nothing about this that is particularly reminiscent of Arnaud Daniel's poetry. But this stanza is very much in lines with the rime Petrose. Vaghi pensier che così passo passo scorto m'avete a ragionar tant'alto. Vedete che Madonna ha il cuor di smalto, sì forte che io per me dentro non passo. Ella non degna di mirarsi basso, che di nostre parole curi, che il ciel non vuole, al qual pur contrastando i son già lasso. Onde come nel cuor m'induro e naspro, così nel mio parlar voglio essere aspro. Che parlo o dove sono, e chi m'inganna altri che io stesso, il desiar soverchio. Già si trascorro il ciel di cerchio in cerchio, nessun pianeta a pianger mi condanna. Se mortal velo il mio vedere appanna, che colpo è delle stelle o delle cose belle? Meco si sta chi di e notte m'affanna, poiché del suo piacer mi fe gir grave, la dolce vista, il bel guardo suave. And so a very Petrarch beginning, and next week we'll see poems that are just like this. What do I say? Where am I? Do I deceive myself? Though I traverse the sky from sphere to sphere, there's no planet that forces me to grieve. And he's just finished talking about Dante, so it's impossible not to think of Paradiso, where Dante literally describes himself going through the celestial heavens. So Petrarch's grief isn't on account of the stars. That is, there's nothing in the natural world or his personal fate that's causing him to grieve. The fault is not in the stars, he says, it's in Laura. Tutte le cose di che il mondo è adorno, uscir buone da man del Maestro eterno, ma me che così addentro non discerno, abbagli il bel che mi si mostra intorno, e s'al vero splendor giammai ritorno, l'occhio non può star fermo, così l'ha fatto infermo pur la sua propria colpa, e non quel giorno chi volsi in ver l'angelica beltade nel dolce tempo della prima etade. And so this beautiful final stanza here. Everything with which the world's adorned issued pure from the eternal maker's hand. And those lines are so Dantesque. The way that Dante describes creation, issuing forth pure from the eternal maker, the eternal master, maestro. But I who cannot discern how to enter in, that Petrarch can't fully embrace the beauty of divinity holy here. He's dazzled by beauty shown all around. He's overwhelmed by the beauty of creation and not the creator. And whenever I turn to the real splendor, that is, whenever I turn myself just to God, my eyesight cannot see true, as if it has been weakened through its own fault, not by that day when I first turned toward that beauty. And so here he's removing the blame from Laura, and it's his own fault that he was harmed on that day, but he persisted in loving her, and his persistence in loving Laura has made it so that he cannot give himself over wholly to loving God. That he's distracted between this mortal love that he's raised up to a level beyond which it can possibly fulfill, um, and which therefore does not allow him to love God as creator. Um, the basic error of loving a created thing as though it's not a created thing. And Augustine talks about this in the early Confessions, I want to say book 5. One of his childhood friends dies. And this is while he's with the Manichees in Carthage, and he's overwhelmed with grief. Um, and he's overwhelmed with grief. He can't get over this because he recognizes he loved a mortal thing as if it were not mortal. That is, as if it were not doomed to die. And it's the lesson that Augustine learns, and he learns it that first time, or at least when writing Confessions later, it might appear that way. The idea here isn't that it's not that you shouldn't love people. That's not at all what Augustine's point was. But it's that when you love people, you need to make sure that you love them as creations of God. The basic mistake that the lover makes, and this is what almost all of troubadour poetry is about, and it's problematized in all of the Italian love poets, is that the lover turns his beloved into an idol, into a god that he tries to draw complete satisfaction from. And of course, that's impossible. And what is more unfair than expecting another human being to be able to satisfy all of your desires, even ones that you don't fully understand yourself? But that's what romantic love taken to its extreme does. Um, and so Petrarch struggles with Laura, um, are loving a creature as though it's not just a creature. I'm dazzled by beauty shown me all around, and such he can't discern how to enter into this beauty that is God. So when I turn to the real splendor, I cannot see true. It's been weakened through its own fault, per la sua propria colpa, and not that day in which I turned towards that beauty in the sweet season of my early youth. Um, so the poem itself is kind of delightfully schizophrenic, um, as it has to be, because Petrarch is citing so many different poets here, picking up their lines and describing the woman in different ways. But we finally leave here when he's citing himself with, the most mature reflection on this. Tutte le cose di che il mondo è adorno, uscir buone de man dal Maestro Eterno. Everything with which the world is adorned issued pure from the eternal Maker's hand. That beautiful line followed up by the sadness that Petrarch cannot enjoy that beauty fully because he's fixated himself on just a creation of that beauty. And now we'll move on to 71, 72, 73, the Canzone degli Occhi, which Dante, or I mentioned Dante at the beginning, and now I'm going to have his name on my tongue for the rest of the lesson. So the Canzone degli Occhi, where Petrarch's set forth this very difficult problem of loving the beautiful world that God has made, but loving it in the correct proportion, loving it as a creation, loving it because it was created by God, not loving it in and of itself, um, because all of creation depends entirely upon God. Only God can be loved in and of himself. But those eyes that are so seductive and that turn Petrarch almost helplessly at times. Perché la vita è breve e l'ingegno paventa all'altra impresa. Né di lui né di lei molto mi fido, ma spero che sia intesa là dove io bramo e là dove esser deve la doglia mia, la qual tacendo i grido. Occhi leggiadri, and so the first appearance of the occhi, the eyes. Occhi leggiadri dove amor fa nido, a voi rivolgo il mio debile stile. Pigro da sé, ma il gran piacer lo sprona. Lovely eyes, I direct my weak verse to you. So the poems are also addressed to Lauda's eyes. The weak verse, of course, is absolute false humility, because Petrarch knows what he's doing in just these beautiful canzoni that he's writing, that by describing Laura's eyes, he's attaining poetic immortality for himself. E chi di voi ragiona, tienda al soggetto un abito gentile, che con l'alme amorose, levando il parte d'ogni pensier vile, con queste alzato vengo a dir or cose, co portate nel cor, gran tempo scose. And it's so weird to think at this point, 70 poems in, does Petrarch have anything new to say about Lauda? Um, because he's been praising her so much that it definitely becomes repetitive. But of course, that's part of the intended effect here. Is there anything less that he has hidden in his heart that he has not yet expressed? Non perché non m'aveggia quanto mia laude ingiuriosa a voi, ma contrastar non posso al gran desio, la qual in me da poi, che vidi quel che pensier non pareggia, non che la vaglia altrui parlaro mio, principio del mio dolce stato rio, my sweet, bitter state. Altri che voi so ben, che non m'intende. Quando agli ardenti rai neve divegno, vostro gentile sdegno, forse calor mia indignitate offende. O se questa temenza non temprasse l'arsura che m'incende, beato venir men, che in lor presenza m'è più caro il morir che il viver senza. And so Petrarch melting like snow in the hot sun under the blazing rays, the ardenti rai, an idea that's going to come up again, and you have to try to think of that image, watching snow melt. It happens imperceptibly, um, but in such a way that the snow's utterly destroyed by the end. Your gentle disdain, vostro gentil sdegno. And that's a good thing, the gentile sdegno. Part of being noble is having disdain for things that are coarse. So a woman who has true nobility should not be greeting the rabble. She should have gentle disdain for them, so that anyone impressed by her is encouraged to make themselves better and be worthy of her acknowledgement. And then again, that question of the death drive, okay, in your presence, it's sweeter to die than to live without you. And in your presence here, it's still addressed to the eyes themselves rather than to Laura directly. Dunque, chi non mi sfaccia, si frale oggetto a si possente foco, non è proprio valor che me ne scampi, ma la paura un poco, che il sangue vago per le vene agghiaccia, risalda il cuor, perché più tempo avampi, o poggi o valli o fiume, o selve o campi, o testimon della mia grave vita, quante volte mi udiste chiamar morte. Ai dolorosa sorte lo star mi strugge, il fuggir non maita, ma se maggior paura non m'affrenasse, via corta e spedita trarrebbe a fin questa apra pena e dura, e la colpa è di tal che non ha cura. And so Petrarch here, going over the top of, when he's not consumed, so frail an object and so fierce a fire, it's not true worth that prevents my ruin, but a little touch of fear that chills the errant blood in my veins. Hills, valleys, rivers, woods, field, witness to my hard life. How many times have you heard me call for death? And one of the things that develops in what's called Petrarchismo, the Petrarchan way of writing, is this melodramatic style that love poets develop. With Petrarch, it kind of works because he knows exactly what he's doing with it. When you're trying to copy someone who's a great artist, usually absurdity is what results in, and that's what happens to a lot of European love poets trying to be Petrarch. Wretched fate, staying destroys me and fleeing is no help. So the contrasts, the contradictory states where nothing is useful, not leaving, not staying. But if a greater fear did not restrain me, a short, swift way would bring this harsh, bitter pain to an end, and the blame would be hers who does not care. So the suicidal thought enters into his mind, but religious belief and fear holds him back. Dolor, perché mi meni fuori di cammino a dir quel che io non voglio? Sostien che io vada ove il piacer mi spinge. Già di voi non mi doglio occhi sopra il mortal corso sereni, né di lui che tal nodo mi distrigne. Vedete ben quanti color de pigne, amor sovente in mezzo del mio volto, e potrete pensar qual dentro fammi. La vedi e notte stammi addosso, col poder che in voi raccolto, luci beate e lieti, se non che il veder voi stesse v'è tolto. Ma quante volte a me vi rivolgete, conoscete in altrui quel che voi siete. And again, the contradictions that just sort of become Petrarch's life, that there's nothing else left. I don't complain of you, eyes, bright beyond what is mortal, nor of him who tied me in this knot. You see what colors love often likes to paint in the midst of my features, and can imagine what he does inside. So the changing colors of the face, the man that's just tormented by passion, um, that has rage and shame and fear going from differing versions of red to white. And if this is what he has on his face, only imagine what's inside, where he stands over me night and day with the power he gathered from you. Blessed and happy lights, luci, in Italian, usually refer to eyes. Blessed and happy lights, except that you cannot turn to see yourselves. So these eyes are blessed, except for the fact that they can't gaze on their own loveliness. Se voi fosse si nota la divina incredibil bellezza di chi io ragiono, come a chi la mira, misurata allegrezza non avria il cor. And it's translated as immeasurable happiness would fill your heart. But Petrarch's, of course, is phrased slightly more complexly, that your heart would not have measured happiness. And it's important that it's measured happiness you wouldn't have, because measured happiness is what actual virtue is. Immeasurable happiness, dismisurata allegrezza, that would be a kind of happiness that has gone off the rails and is sinful in some way or another. Però forse rimota dal vigor natural che vapore e gira, felice l'alma che per voi sospira, lumi del ciel, per li quali io ringrazio la vita che per altro non me aggrado. Blessed is the soul that sighs for you heavenly lights, so that I give thanks for my life that otherwise is worthless. Um, so we're speaking about the felice alma, the anima felix, the soul that is saved, is what those words always refer to. Blessed is the soul that sighs for you, heavenly lights, lumi del ciel, so that I give thanks for life that otherwise is worthless. It's all of this imagery that should be referring to salvation, that Petrarch instead is referring just to the experience of looking on those eyes. Oimè, perché si rado mi date quel donde mai non son sazio? Perché non più sovente mirate qual amor di me fa strazio? E perché mi spogliate immantenente dal ben caro ora l'anima sente? Why do you so rarely grant me what does not sate me? Why do you not more often consider how love wastes me? Why do you not immediately rob me of the good that now and then my spirit feels? So all of this that should be making him happy and without which his life is worthless, is not happiness at all. It's just this taste that is not enough, that does not satiate me. Dico, car ora vostre mercede, I sento in mezzo l'alma, una dolcezza inusitata e nuova, la quale ogni altra salma di noiosi pensier disgombra allora. Sì, che di mille un sol vi si ritrova, quel tanto a me non più del viver giova. E se questo mio ben durasse alquanto, nullo stato agguagliarse al mio porrebbe, ma forse altrui farebbe invido, e me superbo l'onor tanto. Però, lasso, convensi che l'estremo del riso assagli il pianto, e interrompendo quegli spiriti accensi, a me ritorni, e di me stesso pensi. From time to time through your pity, I feel a strange new sweetness that clears my dead weight of harmful thoughts, so that 1,000 only one is left, and that is alone enough to live in joy. Um, and so you have that question of if this is just suffering, why do I continue with it? Because it's that awful suffering that gives just enough hope that you stick with it. And for those of you who are in my Monday night class on that's now reading Boethius, um, in Boethius, we left with that image of the things that we want in this life that can't possibly give happiness, but give just enough that they are a sweet poison. They delight us just enough that we stick with them to our ruin. And that's basically what Petrarch is describing here. And that must be why sorrow attacks laughter in the end, and why I interrupt that burning rapture and return to myself and think of myself again. L'amoroso pensiero ch'alberga dentro in voi mi si discopre tal che mi trae dal cor ogni altra gioia, onde parole ropre escon di me si fatte allor che spero farmi immortal perché la carne muoia. And here we have the combination of Petrarch's false loves, not because they're bad things in and of themselves, but because Petrarch loves them in ways that he shouldn't. The loving thought that loves within is such that it draws away all other joy. This loving thought of Laura removes all other joy, and that's why he cannot devote himself fully to God. And words and deeds arise in me so that I hope I might be made immortal, though the flesh dies. So this is the most pagan sense of immortality possible. The poet who makes himself immortal through his words that will be repeated throughout all of history, even though he dies. the pagans that don't hope for an afterlife, but can only hope to live on in fame in future ages. Um, of Petrarch's classicism, of returning to ancient Rome and ancient Greece and picking up those classical ideals, this is the most of them. Um, Even momentarily ignoring Christian salvation for the hope of secular fame that will last beyond the grave. Fuggi al vostro apparire angoscia e noia, e nel vostro partir tornano insieme, ma perché la memoria innamorata chiude loro poi l'entrata, di là non vanno dalle parti estreme, onde s'alcun bel frutto nasce di me, da voi viene prima il seme, io per me son quasi un terreno asciutto, colto da voi, e il pregio è vostro in tutto. I'm almost a sterile soil in myself, but tilled by you. So the praise is all yours. It's a really weird image. And it's delightfully new because Petrarch's inverted um, what had been otherwise a crude sexual metaphor, that of the woman as a field to be tilled, a field to be plowed. Um, Here, Petrarch's reversed it, and he's turned into a soil that can produce a harvest. The harvest that he's going to produce are these poems that we're reading. Canzon, tu non m'acquetti, anzi mi infiammi a dir di quel che me stesso m'involla, però sia certa di non esser sola. So he ends this, and usually you address the song and it's go off to those eyes and tell them blah, blah, blah. But here Petrarch lets us know that this isn't the end. You do not release me, but you stir me to speak of what tempts me from myself. Therefore, be certain not to exist alone. So Petrarch's going to follow this up with what he'll call at the end of the next canzone his sister song. That we have three sisters here. And the sisters are all about these themes. I'm sorry, just the eyes, not even Laura, but just her eyes that make him blessed, that give him all of his hope, that give him just enough to live on, but through which he hopes to establish immortal fame. And these three canzoni, they are sisters because they follow the exact rhyme scheme um, and structural pattern of the strophes. Um, but here we'll go ahead and we'll pause for a break since there's another 45 minutes of me talking nonstop. And it's so easy as a modern audience to want to read Petrarch, with our age's jaded irony, and to see this as just an author who's kind of inventing some literary tale that he himself doesn't believe in. And that's how a lot of critics, a lot of professional scholars view Petrarch. Um, but of course, that reading of Petrarch is what happens when you come up in an age that doesn't have anything to believe in. If you're part of secular Western culture, there isn't anything that you can fully believe in. So you turn everything into irony and posturing, um, which is completely inappropriate for Petrarch. He's clearly posturing himself as a literary persona here. Um, but he is of an age that believes deeply, and he believes very deeply. And so when he goes back and forth between his desire to set aside the desire for fame and the desire for Lara, he sincerely believes that. And when he speaks of his desire for fame, he very clearly believes that. Um, we can't look at Petrarch with a self-satisfied smile and see all of this as just a poetic game. Uh, we can see someone here who is presenting the very real lived experience of the Christian life, of the attempt of living a life of Christian virtue, that has to combat at all times our most deep-seated flaws. And Petrarch's most deep-seated flaw is that love of fame. Uh, It's one thing to recognize what your flaw is and to know that you have to improve it. It's another to remove it entirely. Um, to recognize that the desire for fame is not just wrong, um, but flawed. And Petrarch knows this. One of the other works that he does is called the Triumphs. Um, he imagines these great Roman triumphs that the conquering emperors used to hold for themselves. Conquering generals would return to Rome and they would have the great parade. They would put forth all of the captives from their war. They would have people throwing trinkets that they had looted from the enemy cities. Um, they would bring forth the enemy king or leader, and he would be executed publicly. And the conqueror himself would be in a chariot pulled by white horses with his face painted red as Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Jupiter, the greatest, the highest, who is the supreme god of the Roman pagan pantheon. Um, and he would have the slave behind him holding up a golden crowned leaf. And supposedly the slave would whisper, remember that you're just mortal, that you only get to play God for a day. Petrarch takes this idea and he writes the various triumphs, and he combines that with Christian personification allegory. And so he has various things that top each other. Um, you have the triumph of love, but the triumph of love is overcome by the triumph of death. That all earthly loves will end in death if they continue throughout the entire earthly life. But then the triumph of death is overcome by the triumph of fame. That fame is able to overcome death. Fame is what allows poets like Petrarch and like Lauda, the subject of Petrarch, to have a life in cultural consciousness that goes beyond the grave. But then the triumph of fame is overcome by the triumph of time, uh, because time will kill all fame. The day will come when Western culture is no more. The day will come when Petrarch is forgotten. The day will come when his name is no longer whispered with love. But then the triumph of time is overcome by the triumph of eternity, the triumph of God, the triumph of salvation. It's a beautiful work. So in that, in that, Petrarch shows very clearly the absurdity of fame, that eventually even fame has to come to an end, that there will come a time where you are forgotten by future cultures that have no knowledge of you. But at the same time, that knowledge does not in and of itself remove the desire for fame that is so firmly implanted in Petrarch. Um, if you've seen the movie Amadeus, one of my favorite films, when F. Murray Abraham is playing the old Salieri, the Salieri that's in the asylum, and the priest comes to offer him confession. And he talks about his struggle when he recognizes how much better of a composer Mozart is than him. And he puts it in this complaint to God that if you don't want me to be your voice, if you've picked Mozart to be your voice, then why did you give me just the ability to recognize that he is your voice? And you've still given me this desire to praise you in song that's implanted in my heart like a disease. Not exactly what he says. I can't remember the exact line, but it's just a beautiful presentation of that desire for fame, that even though you know it's wrong, it's still there like an irremovable pit. The way that F. Murray Abraham just gives those lines, like that is Petrarch, knowing that you shouldn't desire fame, um, but knowing how nearly impossible it is to remove that desire. Gentil mia donna, io veggio nel muover dei vostri occhi un dolce lume che mi mostra la via ch'al ciel conduce. Um, so we start off with a very Dantesque description of love here, that the light that streams from your eyes. And in the Middle Ages, one of the theories about vision is that the eye itself shot out something that they called a visual spirit, and this visual spirit would bounce. It was kind of like imagining that sight worked in the way that sonar or echolocation does. So you imagine the sweet light that bounces out from the eye and then comes back and then gives the eye information. Um, Love poets picked up on this because then they could picture their beloved shooting them darts with these visual spirits. But it's so similar to what Dante describes that shows me the way that leads to heaven. E per lungo costume dentro là dove sol con amor seggio, qual visibilmente il cor traluce. Questa è la vista che ben far m'induce e che mi scorge al glorioso fine. Questa sola dal volgo mi allontana, né giammai lingua umana contar poria quel che le due divine luce sentir mi fanno. E quando il verno sparge la pruine, e quando poi ringiovinesce l'anno, qual era il tempo del mio primo affanno. So this previous way of describing love, the ennobling love, that the desire to be loved by this woman causes the man um, to increase his own virtue. This sight that leads me to do good and drives me toward a glorious end. Only by this distinguished from the crowd. No human tongue could ever say what those two divine lights make me feel. Um, that Laura is pushing him to be better, that Laura is the one that encourages him to be better than the common crowd. And if there's a more Petrarchan word than vulgo, Petrarch is absolutely a social snob, one of the worst that's ever existed. And in an age where the nobility genuinely thought that they were just better people than peasants, that they naturally had more virtue, Petrarch describes the common crowd, the vulgo, with just this dismissiveness that, well, that you still see in certain liberal intellectuals today. So it's a huge compliment to say that Laura alone is what makes him distance himself from the common crowd, but with that delightful Petrarchan disdain. Io penso, se l'assuso, onde il motor eterno delle stelle, degno mostrar del suo lavoro in terra. Son l'altre opere sì belle, aprisi la prigion, ov io son chiuso, e che il cammin a tal vita mi serra. If there are other works as fine above, where the eternal mover of the stars leaned down from to reveal his labors to the earth, open the prison where I am confined that shuts me from the road to such life. If there are things in heaven as fine as Laura. Poi mi rinvolgo alla mia usata guerra. But then immediately after this thought, I just go back to my habitual war. Ringraziando natura e il dì che io nacqui, che reservato mano a tanto bene, e lei che tanta speme alzò il mio cuor, che insino lor io giacqui a me noioso e grave. Da quel dì innanzi a me medesimo piacque, empiendo d'un pensier alto e suave, quel cuor ond'hanno i begli occhi la chiave. And again, all of this is still such the ennobling love um, that leads Petrarch to be better. But it's still a harmful burden to myself. Né mai stato gioioso amor o la volubile fortuna dieder a chi, più fuor nel mondo amici, ch'il non cangiassi ad una rivolta d'occhi, ogni mio riposo vien, come ogni arbor vien dai suoi radici. Ogni mio riposo vien. All of my riposo, rest would be a good translation as well. Peace, yes, but riposo. Um, here it's reminiscent of Augustine's opening lines of Confession, the cor inquietus, the unquiet heart that cannot be at rest until it rests in you. Of course, Petrarch is finding that riposo here in those eyes. And those eyes give him so much peace that he wouldn't trade it for literally anything else. And we're going to sort of skip over the rest of this just because I'd like to get through what I wanted to see. And we get the sense of the poem, where it's going, that Petrarch he's showing a different version of love and sweetness. But it's always this kind of bittersweet sweetness that Petrarch knows he's not getting exactly what he wants out of this, that there's something not quite right in all of this. Certo il fin dei miei pianti, che non altronde il cor doglioso chiama, ven da begli occhi al fin dolce tramanti, ultima speme dei cortesi amanti. Surely the end of my weeping, my grieving heart, does not hope for from elsewhere, will come at last from that sweet tremor of lovely eyes, the final hope of courteous lovers. And Petrarch's syntax is even more contorted in Italian than the translation is here. And the contortions of the syntax are the contortions of Petrarch's mind. That he finally will get the relief from his suffering from these sweet eyes. Canzon, l'una sorella poco innanzi, e l'altro sento in quel medesimo albergo apparecchiarsi, ond'io più carta vergo. And after this beautiful canzone, we have this congedo here, where he sends off his song. And again, he's not sending the song to these eyes, as it would be normal in a canzone. He's openly describing these songs that he's sending out to the world one after another. One sister went a little before you. And again, these three canzoni, 71, 72, 73, they all have the exact same structure. And I sense another one appearing before me. That poetic moment it's swollen up in Petrarch. So he's going to get out another sheet of paper and he's going to write, poiché per mio destino. And again, it's the same contradictions with a slightly different take, but recovering the same ground that he always does. At the start, I thought to find some repose and a truce by speaking of my ardent desires. The thought that writing the poetry itself could cure him of the ill that he feels. Quella speranza ardire mi porse a ragionar quel che sentia. Or m'abbandona al tempo e si dilegua, ma pur conven che l'alta impresa segua continuando l'amorose notte. This hope setting me on fire to talk of what I felt abandoned me in time and vanished. So even the hope that writing about this can make him better. And yet I must follow the high theme, continuing the loving notes. So he set forth a poetic task, and this poetic task that he's going to get his fame through, um, he's got to stick with that. Si potente il voler che mi trasporta la ragione morta, che tenea il freno, el contrastar non pulte. So powerful the wish that drives me on, and reason is dead, that held the reins, so nothing can oppose this. And so I think we'll read this stanza and then move on from the canzone. Dico, se in quella tate, cal vero onor fur gli animi si accesi, l'industria tal quanti uomini s'avvolse per diversi paesi, oggi eronde passando, e l'onorate cose cercando, e il più bel fior ne colsi, poiché Dio e natura e amor volse locar completamente ogni virtute in quei bei lumi, uh, and lumi for the occhi again. Ondi io gioioso vivo, questo e quell'altro rivo, non conven che trapasse, e terra mute. Allor sempre ricorro, come a fontana d'ogni mia salute, e quando a morte disiando corro, sol di lor vista al mio stato soccorro. I say that in those ages when spirits were on fire with true honor. So Petrarch also invents the idea of the Middle Ages. Petrarch's the one that describes this great age that was past in the classical world, this new age that's dawning with him personally, and then this sort of barbaric time in between. The Dark Ages is Petrarch's literal invention. So he's imagining those classical times when men were on fire with true honor. And men had these great efforts, crossing hills and waves and searching for things of honor. The great mission that the Greek heroes were on. But now God and love and nature set every virtue in those bright eyes. So all the things that the great heroes of Greco-Roman mythology sought after, all of that is pulled in, and even more in the eyes of Laura, through which I live in joy. He doesn't need to go forth on these adventures. And this is hilarious, Petrarch not needing to go forth on adventures. If there's anybody who stays in his study and kind of shuts out the outside world, it's Petrarch. Um, he once described himself as writing poetry while floating down a river, but it's almost certain that that itself was just a literary convention. But I always return to them, these eyes, as to the fount of all my blessings, and when in desire I rush towards death, the sight of them alone brings me salvation. So when that death drive comes back, it's Lauda's eyes that, and I don't like the translation salvation for that. Al mio stato soccorro, that he's finding aid, help. Socorro is not usually used in the sense of theological salvation, but the idea there is still kind of perverse, that when he's desiring death, he thinks of Lauda's eyes, not of God. And then three more strophes to continue on these thoughts. And finally, canzone, I sento già stancar la pena, del lungo il dolce ragionar con lei, ma non di parlar meco I pensier me. Song, my pen is already weary of this long, sweet speech with you, but not my thoughts of speaking to myself. So now we have the division between Petrarch as the poet and Petrarch as the human. That Petrarch's separating his literary production that he's sending off. He's tired of writing these poems now. He's done. So he's going to put down his pen. But the nonstop thinking about these things will continue. We might have Petrarch here as the first recorded self-admitted overthinker. And then he immediately follows that up delightfully, poem 74, with, I am already wearied with thinking of how my thoughts are never weary of you, and how I've not abandoned life itself yet to flee so heavy a weight of sighs. The reflection upon reflection here after these poems, and the Canzoni degli Occhi, these are all long poems. If we went through each stanza with commentary, it would have been almost the entire lecture. After all of these long poems, Petrarch then puts in as the very next one, I'm already tired of thinking about how my thoughts are never tired of you. Reflecting on his own obsessive desires that he wishes he could control but can't. 76, I wanted to look at briefly here. Amor con sue promesse lusingando, mi ricondusse alla prigione antica e delle chiavi a quella mia nemica, che di me stesso tenne in bando. Love with his beguiling promises led me back to my ancient prison and gave the keys to my enemy, who still keeps me in exile from myself. So blaming love here as the villain that takes him back to his ancient prison. So we have Petrarch presenting himself as, having been able to escape this once, but love sort of tricking him again, and now he's caught. Concord me di me stesso tenne in bando, who still keeps me exiled from myself. In bando is, this isn't the glorious esilio. Tenere in bando is the phrase that's usually used to describe people who've been kicked out of the Italian cities for political reasons. So there's something about this exile from myself, and just that concept is awful. And again, we could go back to Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy, that the person who is lost and in exile, if you've truly ordered your life properly, no matter what happens to you externally, you aren't lost. You can only be lost when you lose yourself. And that's what's happened here. I did not realize it, alas, until it truly happened. And now with great toil, who'd believe it though I speak on oath, I regain my liberty with sighs. And like a truly close-kept prisoner, I carry the marks of chains on my limbs, and eye and forehead spell what's in my heart. When you are aware of my pallor, you'll say, if I see and judge correctly, this man was not far from death. And so Petrarch has liberated himself again momentarily, liberated with sighs, and he bears the mark of the prisoner, that he's freed himself from the obsession with lore. But it's an obsession that has left its mark and nearly killed him. But in doing so, would have also led him to his perdition. There's a couple of poems here that I don't really want to read, but they're addressed to Simone Martini. Simone Martini was one of the most famous painters of the age, from Siena, and Simone apparently actually painted a portrait of Laura. And that's what Petrarch describes in the poems. Whatever painting it was, that's lost. It's impossible to know what the past had that we no longer have, unless we have something like this, where, yes, Lucy, that's your prayer card. Unless you have something like this, where there's a reference to something that once existed, like this painting, that just no longer does. So 77 and 78 to Simone Martini. And 79, here we have the anniversary poem that is for, you want to go back upstairs with Miss Hands? Okay, she's okay. The anniversary poem for the 14th year. So this is 1341. This is the year that Petrarch goes to Rome and is crowned poet laureate. And he arrives in Rome on Good Friday, and he's crowned poet laureate on Easter Sunday. And the Good Friday that year in 1341, that is the April 6th Good Friday. It's beautiful to see. If the middle and end of these 14 years in which I've sighed should echo the beginning, I'll still have no more help from breeze or shade, though I felt passion's flame increase. Love with whose thoughts I am ever one, under whose yoke I must breathe, so governs me. I am only half a man, turning my eyes too often to my harm. And the language here is, for Petrarch, kind of oddly precise and mathematical, um, dissecting himself. Sal principio risponde il fine il mezzo del 14° anno che io sospiro. The middle and the end and the beginning. And he has two poems that celebrate the 14th year. The next poem that celebrates the same year isn't until poem 101. And in that one, he divides it up rather than these 14 years as the 7 and 7. So we have the 14 years divided up, and Petrarch, who should be only one, is divided himself. And we see that division throughout all of the poem. The Petrarch that wants to love God alone, that wants to be the good, devout Christian, and the Petrarch that is torn with loving Laura and loving Fame. The question of division was one that appeared. Okay, so make that noise, okay? You gotta be quiet. The idea of the internal division, the psychological division of the lover, that was one that appeared throughout the poems of Guido Cavalcanti, one of the authors that Petrarch cited back in poem 70. Poem 80, Chi è fermato di menar sua vida. This is a sestina, and it's a sestina where he really breaks away from Dante with the imagery and the rhyme work that he has, vita, scogli, legno, fine, porto, vela. We have the life, and then we have rocks, ship or vessel, the end, fine, and then port and sails. So we have the two traditional images that nautical imagery, we can ignore the ugliness of that phrasing, is used for. One of them is that you have the ship being tossed at sea, that is an image of the lover, who's tossed about by the passions of love and has no control over his life any more than the helmsman has over his ship in a storm. The other image that we have is the proper way to conduct your life, that the voyage of our life is the voyage at sea. And at a certain point in time, it's proper to pull in the sails and calmly come into port. And that's the end of the life. You make the preparations that are necessary to have a good death and to prepare yourself for salvation. So Petrarch's found a way of taking two traditional images signifying completely different things and bringing them into a sestina that allows him to play with what he's been working with, what he's been struggling with throughout the entire thing so far. And this is one of the beautiful penitential poems where Petrarch's recognizing his own error. So as we're running out of time, this one is worth reading in its full. Again, for the wonderful sounds created by the sestina. Chi è fermato di menar sua vita, su per l'onde falade per gli scogli, scevro da morte con un picciol legno, non può molto lontano esser dal fine. Però sarebbe da ritrarsi in porto mentre al governo ancor crede la vela. Lauro suave, a cui governo e vela comisi, And that breathe, that soft, gentle breeze in Italian is lauda. And the way that lauda, the auda, the breeze would have been written in Italian is with, there's no punctuation in it, or there's not modern punctuation. There's no apostrophes in the Italian. So it just appears in the manuscript as lauda. Entrando all'amorosa vita e sperando venire a miglior porto, poi mi condusse in più di 1000 scogli, e le cagion del mio doglioso fine non pur d'intorno avea, ma dentro al legno. Chiuso gran tempo in questo cieco legno, errai. And that verb to wander, the Italian verb is errare, um, the same word that gives us error. So to wander is to err. Errai senza levar occhio alla vela, che innanzi al mio di mi trasportava al fine. Poi piacque a lui che mi produsse in vita, chiamarmi tanto indietro dagli scogli, almen da lunge mi apparisse il porto. Come lume di notte in alcun porto vide mai d'alto mar nave né legno, se non gli tosse o tempestate o scogli. Così di su la gonfiata vela vidi io le insegne di quell'altra vita, e allor sosperai verso il mio fine. Non perché io sia sicuro ancor del fine, che volendo col giorno esser a porto e gran viaggio in così poca vita, poi temo che mi veggio in fraile legno e più non vorrei, piena la veglia del vento che mi pinse in questi scogli. Se io esca vivo dei dubbiosi scogli ed arrive il mio esilio ad un bel fine, che sarei vago di voltar la vela e l'ancore gittare in qualche porto. Se non ch'io ardo come acceso legno, sì m'è duro a lasciar l'usata vita. Signor della mia fine e della vita, prima che fiacchi il legno tra gli scogli, drizza a buon porto la fenata vela. Lord of my end and of my life, before my vessel shatters on the rocks, drive me to port with storm-tossed sails. So it ends with this just beautiful prayer, where Petrarch, seeing his life that's been led astray, willingly and not at times, if I can escape from dangerous rocks and my exile comes to a good end, I'd be content to furl my sails and cast anchor in any port. If only I don't blaze a burning vessel. It's so hard for me to leave the old life. Si me duro a lasciar l'usata vita. I mean, that line there, if there's any line from medieval poetry that can speak across the ages to all of us, anyone who's tried to reform the mistaken ways of their life and knows how hard that is and how many failures one encounters and how many times one vows to improve oneself, starts, fails, and again, it's so hard for me to leave the old life. But then closing with that beautiful prayer that brings all these words together, Lord of my end and of my life, before my vessel shatters on the rocks, drive me to port with storm-tossed sails. That even through the tribulations of life, rescue me from eternal shipwreck, rescue me from perdition, even with the weary storm-tossed sails. And I don't think there's a more appropriate place to end the night's lecture than on that. So at that point, we'll simply stop. Although 81 is beautiful as well. Petrarch actually maintains this thought for two poems before immediately reversing on it. So we'll go ahead and read the last one. You just can't stop with this. I son si stanco sotto il fascio antico delle mie colpe e dell'usanza ria, che io temo forte di mancar tra via e di cadere in man del mio nemico. Ben venne a deliverarmi un grande amico, per somma ed ineffabil cortesia, poi volò fuor della veduta mia, sì camerarlo indarno, ma fatico. Ma la sua voce ancor qua giù rimbomba. O voi che travagliate, ecco il cammino. Venite a me se il passo altri non serra. Qual grazia, qual amore o qual destino mi darà penne in guisa di colomba che mi riposi e levimi da terra. So continuing the thought of the previous poem, so wearied by the ancient, and the ancient burden is sin, of course. Um, I have a deep fear of erring on the road and falling into my enemy's hands. So now we've moved off from shipwreck into um, taking the wrong turn and falling into the hands of the enemy, the devil. And Christ comes to rescue with noble and ineffable courtesy. Um, Christ, who has all of the virtues, even proper behavior. And then flew far away from my sight. And the sight that he's fixed on Lara fails him here. I strive to see him, but in vain. But his voice still echoes down here. And especially after that last poem, with that longing of coming into port. Come unto me, all you that labor, behold the path if no one blocks the way. What grace, what love, what destiny will grant me the wings of a dove to lift from the earth and be at rest. And che mi riposi, and that verb again, that I might repose myself. Um, and of course, it's divine grace, divine love, divine destiny, predestination. So much like Petrarch here, I just can't stop. We had the previous stop, but then we have to read one more. I really will stop on that one. Um, thank you for being here tonight. Next week, we'll move on. Poems 127 through, I think, 214 is how they've been numbered. It's a long section. But it's Petrarch, so it's the same idea again and again and again, only slightly differently each time. So thank you all very much. So we'll end with the penitential thoughts for Lent of the ancient sin and the habit of vice that is so hard to remove. And we hope we can bring ourselves simply to the point of desiring God's grace in our life to make those changes, to no longer desire that sweet poison that is sin. So thank you very much, and I'll see you all next